Mr. President, the hope for this evening was that by extending a formal invitation to our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, somebody would come to the floor who was not just outright denying that climate change is happening. And for a while in Senator Inhofe's remarks, he was focusing on the economics of various types of regulation. And I thought, oh, well, maybe we can have a conversation about what the best way is to solve the climate change problem. But towards the end of his remarks, he got back to denying that it's happening at all, which makes a tough place to begin negotiations. There are plenty of other Republican senators in this body. Many of them have worked on this issue in the past. I don't know whether it's a coincidence or not, but the level of activity by Republican senators on climate change collapsed shortly after the United States Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United. And as many of my Republican friends have pointed out to me on the floor here, there have been times when the big money, the dark money, the anonymous election money that's been thrown around since that decision, there have been times when that money has been spent more against Republicans than against Democrats. So we hope that as we resolve that issue, some of our friends find a way back to the positions that they've held in the past, back to campaigning nationally on climate issues, back to supporting bipartisan climate legislation, back to supporting a carbon fee, back to voting for a cap and trade bill. That's where they've been before Citizens United, and we'd hope to bring them back. But the champion sent by the Republican side to represent their point of view tonight was Senator Inhofe, who has written a book saying that this is all just a big hoax. So in that sense, it was disappointing. I've heard these arguments before, and as you go down the list, I think it's worth taking a moment to knock them aside. One of my personal favorites is that EPA is doing this after the issue was repeatedly blocked in Congress. Well, yeah, it's been blocked in Congress by coal and oil and polluter interests. So the interests that have blocked the highway don't get to complain when traffic has to take a detour. We'd be delighted to work on serious climate legislation in this body. We would be delighted to have it be here. For a lot of reasons, we would get a better result if we did climate legislation than we can through the EPA rule. This is the place where the conversation should take place. But when the oil and the coal and the polluting industries take the position that this is not real, and when they force the Republican Party into that position, that climate change is not real, then we're obviously not going to have a very meaningful discussion about solving a problem. And that's what forces it to EPA. But it's a little rich for those who've shut down this forum for solving this problem to complain when it gets solved in another and less efficient way. You don't very well get to do that. The high cost of the solution, I think Senator Inhofe said $300 to $400 billion, and that it's not disputed. Well, yeah, it's totally disputed. It's absolutely disputed. In fact, it's not even true. The best way to solve this problem is with a revenue-neutral carbon fee. What does revenue neutral mean? Revenue neutral means that every dollar that comes in from the carbon pollution fee that the polluters have to pay goes right back out to the American people, straight back into the economy. 100 cents on the dollar back to the American people is what I would like to see. You can do it through tax reductions. And organizations as conservative as the American Enterprise Institute, have co-authored a report with the Brookings Institution on a carbon tax, they call it. I call it a carbon pollution fee, because when you're giving all the money straight back to the American public, it's not really a tax. It's not general revenue to the government. It goes straight back out. When you do that, I think there's a case to be made that that actually propels the economy. That's actually better for the economy. Investing in innovation, supporting the types of energy creation that we can build here in America is inevitably going to be better for our economy than having to use fossil fuels, having to clean up after the pollution, having to deal with the foreign countries that traffic in fossil fuels. It's all a better circumstance. The senator from Oklahoma also said that this is the product of what he called the radical environmentalist movement. The radical environmentalist movement. Well, one group that speaks very strongly on climate change is NASA. NASA, right now, is driving around a rover on the surface of Mars. They built a rover that's about the size of an SUV. They launched it into space. They landed it successfully on the planet Mars, and they're now driving it around. Do you think these people know what they're talking about? Do you think that's a radical environmentalist movement? NASA? Really? That's conspiracy theory run amok if you think that NASA is part of a radical environmentalist movement. How about our military? National Security and the Accelerating Risks of Climate Change by the CNA Military Advisory Board. CNA Corporation is a corporation comprised largely of retired military who are kept on in that role to advise the military on emerging issues. It's sort of a think tank for the U.S. military that has been there through Republican and Democratic administrations alike. And this report, National Security and the Accelerating Risks of Climate Change, has some interesting folks on this military advisory board that published the report. How about Brigadier General Gerald E. Galloway, Jr., the former dean at the United States Military Academy, the dean at West Point. You think he's part of a radical environmentalist movement? How about Lee Gunn, the former Inspector General of the Department of the Navy? Doesn't seem like a very radical environmentalist to me. Admiral Skip Bowman, former director of the Naval Nuclear Propulsion Program. General James Conway, former Commandant of the Marine Corps. Now, there are some radical left-wing environmentalists for you, the U.S. Marines. You know, this is so far beyond that. Not only are there organizations like Walmart, Coke and Pepsi, Ford and GM, UPS and Federal Express, Target, Nike, VF Industries, one of the biggest apparel manufacturers in the country, located in North Carolina, all totally on board with this. The military, totally on board with this. NASA, totally on board with this. National Science Foundation, every major scientific organization in the country, every single one. So let's not pretend that this is some fringe group of radical environmentalists trying to foist an idea on the country. This is a fringe residue of oil and coal and polluting interests trying to prevent the end of a long holiday they've had from any responsibility for all the harm that their carbon pollution has caused. And let me tell you firsthand, there is harm happening in Rhode Island, in my home state, and it's not deniable. The deniers will never talk about the oceans. They will never talk about the oceans. They'll talk about distant climate theory all day long. But when you go to the sea does not bear false witness. Sea level is rising. You measure that with essentially a yardstick nailed to the end of the pier. A tide gauge is not a complex thing. And off the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, the seas are up 10 inches since the 1930s. Why is that? Because we've known since Abraham Lincoln was president that when you add carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, it warms the planet. That's not a hypothesis. That has been established science since Abraham Lincoln, in his stovepipe hat, drove around Washington in a carriage. And we know that billions of tons of carbon dioxide have gone up there. And we know further that it's virtually all of the heat's gone into the oceans. And unless somebody wants to deny the law of thermal expansion, and I haven't heard anybody willing to deny that yet, then when you warm up the ocean, guess what? It expands and it rises. And we in Rhode Island see 10 inches higher seas to be thrown at our shores by a big storm or hurricane. Makes a big difference. I challenge my colleagues on the other side to give me just 5 minutes of their time, 5 minutes of their time, and go to Google and look up Hurricane of 1938 images and look at the pictures of what happened in my state when the sea level was 10 inches lower. Senator Inhofe mentioned the Chamber of Commerce study. I'm a little surprised he did that because he's not the first Republican to mention the Chamber of Commerce study. Speaker Boehner mentioned the Chamber of Commerce study too. He earned a false from PolitiFact for referencing that study. The Washington Post gave it 4 Pinocchios. You know, Pinocchio, the long nose for not telling the truth. So that was a strange place to go. And he said there's been no temperature increase. Quote, it didn't happen. It did happen. It absolutely did happen. It happened in the oceans, where more than 90% of the heat goes. It happened in the oceans. And you can measure that with thermometers. It is not complicated. And if you go to Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, you will see that it's 3 to 4 degrees warmer mean winter water temperature. And that has a real effect on Rhode Islanders. Men used to go out in boats with trawls, and they'd catch winter flounder in Narragansett Bay, and it was a cash crop, a fishery that fed their families. It is 90% crashed. And a significant part of that is because the bay is no longer hospitable to winter flounder when it's 3 to 4 degrees warmer. It simply doesn't work. The public is with us, and we will get this done. We've seen tonight what we're up against. That not one Republican in this building would come tonight on our invitation and say one word about climate change being real. Not one Republican, not one word. So that's what we're up against. But they have lost the American public. And so the fall of the denial castle is inevitable. It is built on sand. The sand is eroding. It is eroding. Even among young Republican voters, self-identified Republican voters under the age of 35, the hypothesis offered by the deniers, the hypothesis that climate change isn't real, is viewed as, and these are the words from the poll, not my words, ignorant, out of touch, or crazy. I submit, Madam President, that a party whose own voters under the age of 35 view that party's position of denying climate change as ignorant, out of touch, or crazy is a party that needs a new position on climate change. They're not even selling their own young voters, and they're certainly not selling the general public, which wants the president to do something about this in enormous numbers, 70 and 80%, depending on whether you're looking at Democrats, independents, or the full population. Let me close with two specifics, because we often have these debates sort of at the IPCC versus the Sierra Club level. Well, I've been going around to different states, and I've been looking at what's going on state by state. I've been to 7 states already, and I want to mention 2 tonight. Just got back from New Hampshire, the most recent trip. What is going on in New Hampshire? New Hampshire, as many people know, has a big ski industry. It is a winter holiday destination, a winter vacation and tourism destination. And skiing is a big part of that. I met with the guy who runs the Cranmore ski mountain. They have, I want to say, tripled, thereabouts, the number of snowmaking guns that they have on their slopes. And they've gotten better at it. They've made it more efficient, so they make more snow. So as there's less snowpack in the mountains, they're able to get around it by making more snow. But the reality of this is proven by the fact that they have to go out there and make more snow. And as the New Hampshire officials said, that's fine for the slopes. You can get out there and you can roar those guns all night long and make snow on those mountain slopes. But if you're a Nordic skier, you've got to go out on trails, and there's no economic way to blow snow onto trails. If you're a snowmobile enthusiast, you go out on snow trails, and there's no economic way to blow snow onto snowmobile trails. And they are seeing a dramatic falling off in Nordic and snowmobile tourism as a result, the availability of that important market for them. 2 animals they talked about. Start with the moose. It's a pretty iconic species for New Hampshire, I was told. They're moose tours. Who knew? People go up to New Hampshire to look at moose. It's a multi-million-dollar industry, moose touring. I learned something new on the trip. Well, that industry is suffering from a couple of things. First of all, sometimes they do the moose tours on snowmobiles. No snow, no snowmobile moose tour. But worse, indeed eerily, horrifyingly, creepily, the moose are dying off because they are being overwhelmed by ticks. Now, picking a tick off my dog is enough to give me a little bit the heebie-jeebies. And if I find one on myself, it's a little creepy. We're not talking about 1 tick on these moose. We're not talking about 100 ticks on these moose. We're not even talking about 1,000 ticks on these moose. We're talking about 50 to 100,000 ticks per moose. So much that they can't keep themselves healthy. The blood is being sucked out of them by tens of thousands of ticks. And so the expert in that area who spoke to me said that the reaction from the mothers is to just have 1 calf instead of 2. That keeps the population from growing. And the calves basically starve. They die of anemia. They can't feed themselves. They can't keep a blood system running that feeds themselves and the thousands of ticks. Tens of thousands of ticks. And these things grow to be the size of a blueberry or a grape. I mean, it's really appalling. This is an emblematic mammal of New Hampshire, and this is what's befalling it. And what do the New Hampshire folks say is causing it? The retreat of the snow. The ticks, when they're falling and breeding and laying their eggs or whatever the heck they do to reproduce. I'm no tick expert, but they do it on Earth now. Whereas when they fell onto snow, boom, that was it. And so the explosion in the tick population and the disgusting infestation of these poor animals is directly related to the retreat of the snow. Last thing on New Hampshire, state bird is evidently the purple finch. Purple finch has a very particular kind of habitat. Because of the way the climate is changing, that habitat is shrinking. And one of the bird experts that I spoke to said they're looking at the prospect of the purple finch being something that New Hampshire folks have to go to Canada to find. Their state bird have to go to Canada to find it. The other state I'll close with is Florida. Florida is ground zero for climate change. In Florida, great cities are flooding at high tide. The systems that used to drain water out of the cities in a rainstorm are now flooding salt water into the cities because of sea level rise at high tides. I've met with former mayors and county commissioners who've shown me pictures of people riding their bicycle hub deep through water on a bright sunny day. It's not raining. It's salt water. It's come up. One picture was of a yard where the homeowner had hammered a sign into their yard, "No wake zone," so that cars driving by on the flooded road wouldn't create a wake and wash more salt water up into their yard. Some weren't so lucky, and the water was right through the front door and into the house. The Republican mayor of Monroe County has made climate change a priority. She has instructed her county government to do a climate change report looking particularly at sea level rise. Republican mayor of Monroe County. And yet, what do we hear from the Republican side here? Not a peep. Not a peep. She said something else that's interesting, and I'll close with this. I asked her how the coral reefs were doing. A lot of people go down to Florida to snorkel and to scuba dive and to see the wonders of the world under the sea. And I said, well, Mayor, how are your reefs doing? I've heard a lot about what acidification and warming temperatures are doing to reefs. She said, they're still beautiful. And then she paused, and then she said, unless you were here 10 or 20 years ago. 10 or 20 years, and you see that change. What's happening in the reefs is really catastrophic. My friends on the other side never want to talk about this. They want to talk about climate modeling. You don't need a model to go to the end of the dock at Fort Pulaski and see how much the sea level has risen. You measure it. It's simple. Same thing at the Naval War College. You measure it. It's simple. You don't need complex computer models to go to Narragansett Bay and see that it's nearly 4 degrees warmer mean winter water temperature and all the changes that happen as a result. You use a thermometer. It's not complicated. And the acidification of the oceans that is affecting the coral reefs and so many other creatures. It wiped out in the Northwest oyster spat. People grow oysters in the Pacific Northwest, and the seawater that came in was so acidic, it dissolved the shells of the baby oysters and wiped out a huge percentage of their crop. That you measure with the same kind of litmus tests that kids do their aquariums with. It's not complicated. But they always want to talk about where it can be confusing. They never want to confront the problem. Well, we're going to find ways to continue to insist on confronting this problem. They may not be here tonight, but as the old saying goes, you can run, but you can't hide. And there are too many of my colleagues who have been helpful and good on this issue before. As I said, before Citizens United. If you look at the Republican Senate activity on climate change before Citizens United and after, it's like looking at a heart attack. You see steady activity until Citizens United, and then it is flatline. Citizens United, dark money, polluter money, have done as much damage polluting our democracy as they have done polluting our planet. But we are going to continue to do something about it, and the American public not only is with us, they are going to insist on it. I yield the floor.